Hi, everybody, for coming and for acting nice so far. I know many of you in your alter egos, and I'm surprised y'all so calm. Just a couple of house cleaning things. After Curtis gets through talking, you may get your book signed, and we ask that we're going to do it communion style. So we ask you to continue to stay in your seat. We'll be signing right here, and we'll start with the front and work our way through it. Okay. And if you got any questions or you need to leave or leave your book here and get it signed later, whatever, holler at me or somebody here. A few of our upcoming events tomorrow at 5:30, we're going to have a Zoom event with our own Chris Offit, who lives here in Oxford, with his brand new book, which is really exciting. It's a suspense book, The Killing Hill, and he's going to be in conversation with the comedian and writer Patton Oswalt. On June 12th, Ace Atkins will have an event with his new book, The Heathens, and that's going to be at the Old Armory Pavilion. It's going to be outside. Be sure, if you like, to BYOB and to BYOC as chair as well. Kate Moore is going to be providing music there. Again, that's July the 12th. And then we've got two Crossroads events. These are the events that we started doing on Zoom after George Floyd's murder, trying to use books as a way to have conversations about race. And the first of these two is going to be June the 23rd. Many of y'all know Barbara Phillips, who taught the law school here, and now I think is retired and is teaching adjunct in studies. She's going to be interviewing the two authors of a book that Harvard University Press. It's just come out, called Justice Deferred: Race in the Supreme Court. Supposedly the first book of its kind that does that kind of in-depth analysis. And the second Crossroads book event will be on July the 7th with Theodore Johnson, Ted Johnson, for his book, When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America. He's a career Navy person who was a White House fellow and speechwriter, and he's going to be in conversation with former Mississippi Governor and Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, and that's going to be a Zoom event July the 7th. But we're here today for Curtis Wilkie and his book. It was released just today, When Evil Lived in Laurel, the White Knights and the Murder of Vernon Damer. Many of you know he's a native of Summit, Mississippi. Received his BA here at the University of Mississippi in 1963. Most of his career as a journalist was with the Boston Globe, where his last stint was bureau chief in New Orleans. I think maybe, did you invent that bureau? Did you create that? and in 2001, he came to Oxford, soon joined the journalism faculty at the University of Mississippi, where he made a notable contribution. Those of us who have been around here for a while have been able to see that Curtis has had the same effect on both the university and the community, the same sort of effect that Willie Morris had when he was here in the 1980s. Curtis's previous books include Arkansas Mischief, Dixie, The Fall of the House of Zeus, a collection of essays published by the University Press of Mississippi entitled Assassins, Eccentrics, Politicians, and Other Persons of Interest, and The Road to Camelot, his JFK book that was co-authored with Tom Oliphant, Tom Oliphant, who's been here to Oxford to visit several times. It's always good to have seen him here. Finally, you all here are participants in a bit of a Square Books record. This is the first event we have had in 465 days. I didn't know that was going to happen. And I could not be happier that it's here for Curtis Wilkie today to start us over again. Thank you, Curtis. Now, welcome, Curtis Wilkie.
There. Put bad boys in schools in the old days. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here. It's so good to see a lot of old friends and people back at an event at Square Books. And that even better.
Even
Okay, good. Thank you. So, Richard and Lynn and all the staff at Square Books, and thank you all for your TLC down through the years with all of us who read and sometimes write. And it's a great institution here in Oxford. Good to be back. Good to see everybody. Before I started, I just want to recognize a few friends and family. My dear friend, Mimi Graves from Memphis, to whom the book is dedicated. I see at least 3 of my grandchildren, Eric McCool and Cameron Wilkie from Boston. Your sister Morgan, where's Morgan? Oh, there's Morgan, right around there. Morgan Wilkie, who is a senior at Ole Miss. So she came down here from Boston to go to school. And Campbell, my son-in-law, Campbell McCool, is way back here in the back. And then I especially want to introduce members of the family of the hero of my book, the late Tom Landrum. His son, Mike Landrum, and my wife, Amy, are here. And do you have any other members of the family that I haven't seen?
It should be here shortly.
They're coming. Okay, there'll be other Landrums, but as I told Mike the other day, I feel like we're all family now. We have worked on this project together for more than 3 years. I guess I should start by just telling you a little bit of how it's kind of an unusual book. Usually, a writer kind of brainstorms and comes up with his own idea. It may come from questions or, of special knowledge about a particular subject. Well, this one was kind of presented to me, but in a very secretive way. It was a bit more than 3 years ago, and Mike, correct me if any of this sequence is inaccurate, but I got a cryptic call from my friend John Evans, who is Richard's counterpart at another wonderful Mississippi bookstore, Lemuria. And he simply said, would you be interested in seeing some material that deals with the Ku Klux Klan and from an inside source? And he didn't really say much more. And I said, well, sure. I had no plans to write another book, but I was interested because I got my start as a journalist in the 60s, and the story was the civil rights movement. And it's always been a frame of reference to me. So I then was contacted by a lawyer in Jackson named Mike Frescona, who was representing the family in the handling of this material. And he, again, I didn't know who they were or what it was. And Mike came up here and spent part of an afternoon talking to me and essentially giving me, as we say in journalism, giving me a little leg, showing me a little bit of what he had, and I was intrigued. So at that point, on another day, I drove down to Jackson, met Mike, and we drove to place called the Landrum Homestead, right outside of Laurel, where I met the Landrums, and I met Tom Landrum, who had joined the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in 1965 at the behest of an FBI agent. There was a local agent in Laurel named Bob Lee. And Tom, at that time, in 65, he would have been a 33-year-old youth court counselor and working with young people and young kids who had problems. And as a result, he dealt regularly with the FBI. It's kind of a law enforcement question. And Bob Lee told him, said, we're having a hell of a time with the White Knights. Headquarters were in Laurel. But the year before, they were the ones responsible for the 3 horrific murders in Neshoba County, when the 3 young civil rights workers were killed. And it's been infamy for Mississippi ever since that time. So the White Knights were responsible for that. White Knights had been formed in 64. And there are always a bunch of kind of a motley group of Ku Klux Klan organizations, and there were different groups in Mississippi, and sometimes they were rivals. They would try to outdo each other in terms of violence or whatever. So White Knights were led by a guy named Sam Bowers, who by that time was living in Laurel. He ran a jukebox and pinball machine operation called Sambo Amusement Company, and he was the Imperial Wizard. So more about him later. But anyway, Tom Landrum was an active member of the Klan, didn't go on any missions, but went to a lot of meetings. And he reported regularly to the FBI, but sometimes daily. At other times it might be as much as a week or 2 before he had something to report. He kept a copy of everything he had turned into the FBI, and basically like reading a diary. It's a lot of personal observations, personal thoughts, and awful lot of information. Who was at the meeting? Here's what they said, and he was hearing a lot of threats to do things. The main threat that was coming through at the Klan meetings was, we're going to get this guy named Vernon Damer, who was in the next county, in Forest County. He lived right outside of Hattiesburg. And Vernon Damer was the president of the NAACP in Hattiesburg, and a very active figure in the movement, and was widely respected in Forest County by blacks as well as whites. A very popular person. He had antagonized some of the elected officials in Forest County, particularly the circuit clerk in Forest County. He antagonized more than one. First one was a guy named Luther Cox, who threw Vernon Damer off of the voting rolls in 1949. This arbitrary decision that they essentially purged the rolls and said, we're going to start all over. When they started all over, they were sure they weren't going to register any blacks. So that became Vernon Damer's chief determination, was to not only to get back as a voter, but also to encourage and get as many blacks in Forest County as he could to register. And by the 60s, the circuit clerk in Forest County was a fellow named Theron Lynn, who became a very prominent figure that civil rights people never forgot, because he was determined no blacks would ever be registered to vote in Forest County. And so he was at cross purposes with Sarah and Lynn in Forest County. Meanwhile, in Jones County, where Tom Landrum lived and worked in the same courthouse with circuit court, there was a man named Leonard Caves. Leonard Caves was a member of the Klan, and he was trying to recruit Tom Landrum to join up. By that time, they had several hundred members in Jones County alone and several thousand in the state. So the stage is kind of set for the beginning of the book. It's involves three principal characters, and I'll just subject you to a few passages from the book that kind of fills in my own description of them, and then I'll talk some more, and then I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. But you know, Landrum was a member of a very well-known family in Jones County. A lot of Landrums down there, as I discovered. And as I said, he was a youth court counselor, but he had gone to Jones Junior College where he was a football star and got a scholarship to the University of Louisville, and eventually came back home and got his degree from Mississippi College. He then taught school. He taught for a while at Central High in Jackson, and eventually wound up in Jones County, where he was originally from. You know, and never been in any kind of trouble, but you know, he told Leonard Caves, "Well, I've decided I'd like to join up with you guys." I think Tom Landrum, who I got to know, Tom died just before Christmas in 2019. And he was late 80s, Mike, 86, 87. So I was able to spend a good bit of time with him personally, as well as to be given access to all of his papers. Tom's a good example of a lot of people in Mississippi who were troubled by what was going on. I mean, a lot of white people, I mean, those of us who are my age, remember that you know, people were largely horrified by what happened in Neshoba County. They were horrified by the murder of Medgar Evers, and they became horrified over what happened to Vernon Damer. So Tom was a guy probably a lot like my parents, who were very much opposed to the Klan and very much in favor of civil rights, but were reluctant to say much about it. I know my mother at least spoke up in the church that my stepfather was the pastor, saying, you know, when they voted to integrate the church, if any black wanted to come, my mother said, someone says, "Where are they going to sit?" And my mother says, "Come sit with me." So, you know, there were a lot of us whites who were troubled by the Klan. Tom Landrum was like that. So, just to give you a little sense of Landrum, as I wrote it in the book, Landrum was neither an outspoken man nor ready to challenge publicly the system that governed Mississippi and Jones County. But as he grew older, he began to resent the overt racism and outnumbered minority, like an outnumbered minority of other white Mississippians. He felt a nagging concern over the horror of Neshoba County murders and the refusal of the state's political leaders to accept any laws that might weaken segregation. By the time Tom Landrum was a young man working in county government, he saw that most of the white citizens had been inhibited by Mississippi's strong inclination to resist change. He too was reluctant to speak against the system. By maintaining this silence, he knew he was abetting an unfavorable international image of white Mississippians as no better than a bunch of ignorant louts and bigots. There seemed to be little incentive to speak out. The white churches were timorous. The newspapers in the state were mostly supportive of segregation, and politicians who might have been willing to make peace with the federal government had been defeated in the past two statewide elections. Inside white Mississippi, no civic clubs or social organizations dared to question segregation. If one were to raise opposition to status quo, Tom saw, it would have to be done privately. So he did by joining the Klan and agreeing to report to the FBI. I use as the top graph of the book a quote I've always liked from the Irish statesman Edmund Burke. Sometimes mistaken as a Brit, but he was an Irish representative to the British Parliament 200 years ago. It's a very simple line. He said that the only, I'm gonna garble it now, help me. I knew I'd freeze up on this. I never could recite poetry. Yeah, the only thing to
Yes.
The only thing
prevent
that's,
the, help me, the only thing to prevent, God, I really messed it up. Anyway, it's a great quote. But the bottom line says, is for good men to do nothing. And always resonated with me, and unfortunately, just blew the operative line. But Tom Landrum was a good man. Bernie Damer talked about his work, and particularly in voting rights down there. And by 65, by the time Bernie Damer was being targeted by the Klan, the Voting Rights Act of 65 had just been enacted. And he then worked very closely with young lawyers from the Civil Rights Division, the Justice Department. A lot of them were, some of them were friends of mine who had been recruited by Bobby Kennedy to work in the Justice Department. And he was, Damer was very well known by people, but not as well known as he deserves to be. Just give you just one brief description of Damer. He was a successful businessman and a fairly big farmer. He had a couple of 100 acres that he farmed. He had his own store, had a nice home. He had a number of children, but he kind of pushed it aside in his drive on behalf of his race and his determination that they win their civil rights. Here's from the book. Despite his relative comfort, Damer was not content. He began to take a role in local affairs in 1946 when he and B.F. Bourne, a fellow farmer at Kelly Settlement, who operated a grocery store in a black neighborhood in Hattiesburg, founded the Forest County chapter of the NAACP. They discovered a growing interest in the organization, especially among black servicemen who had returned from the war to find the same old discrimination at home. 4 years later, Damer joined 14 others in filing a lawsuit against the circuit clerk Luther Cox for his refusal to allow blacks to register to vote. As a young man, Damer had once qualified to vote, but when authorities ordered a re-registration to purge the rolls in 49, Cox rejected his attempts to sign up again, relying on the state law that permitted voter registrars to test applications with an interpretation of a selected provision of the Mississippi Constitution. Cox repeatedly denied Damer. He said Damer and dozens of other blacks were unable to explain the meaning of one sentence. Quote, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property except by due process of the law. Close quote. Cox reassured local whites that he could keep the voting rolls pure by asking other questions of black applicants, such as, how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? The lawsuit against the county official got nowhere during this period when it was considered unthinkable for blacks to take legal action like this. Instead of accepting his fate, Damer continued to push for the right to vote, and he encouraged others to beat a path to the courthouse. Finally, we come to the third man in the three major figures in the book, and it's Sam Bowers. I had some familiarity with the whole Damer case and Sam Bowers because, as reported in the Boston Globe, I covered the final trial of Bowers in 1998, where he was convicted and finally sent to prison for the rest of his life, and he died in prison. But he was a well-known figure in this. He was the imperial wizard of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and he's truly an evil man. I had my one personal brush with him at the first day of the trial when the judge invited the reporters who were there to sit in his chambers for the selection of the jury. It's called process called voir dire. And we all sat around the big table, and I found myself sitting next to the imperial wizard. And I had thought from a distance in the courtroom before we went back to the chamber that he was a well-dressed fellow. He looked like he was in a nice suit. And when I got closer to him, I saw he was old and frayed, and it was turning yellow with age. And he had two Mickey Mouse pins in each lapel. So at the first recess during the proceedings, I turned to him and I says, Mr. Bowers, what's with it with Mickey Mouse? And he looked at me and he went, he never said a word. He never said a word during the entire trial. He didn't testify. He sat there woodenly. He was represented by a complete idiot lawyer who was a Klan lawyer named Travis Buckley. There were a couple of interesting moments. At one point, Buckley is interrogating one of the witnesses, and he says, and tell me who was at that Klan meeting. And the witness says, well, you were there, Mr. Buckley. Another one of the Klansmen was one of Bowers' best friends, a guy named Devers Nix. He testified that he joined the Klan because it was a benevolent organization that delivered gift boxes at Christmas, and it provoked quite a laugh too. So anyway, I had spent time with the Damer family, with Vernon Damer's widow and his son Vernon Jr. This was all nearly 25 years ago, but they were really a lovely family, and everybody knew what Bowers was up to. He had already been arrested for his role in orchestrating the Neshoba County murders, and one of the key witnesses in this upcoming trial was a guy that had talked to me before the trial and told me about as a teenager he had worked for Bowers. His name was Bob Stringer, and he heard the order to Vernon Damer gets a code 4, and in code language of the Klan, code 4 meant determination to kill him. And code 1, I think, was a simple cross burning or something. Code 2 was something else, and code 3 was beat the crap out of somebody, but not kill them. So this is Sam Bowers from the book. For a leader who commanded a following of thousands of Mississippi Klansmen committed to fighting the civil rights movement, Bowers did not appear particularly messianic. The 42-year-old man had a slight frame, lacked a strong speaking voice, and looked more milquetoast than menacing. He wore his hair long enough to allow a careful part, but an unruly lock repeatedly fell across his forehead, giving him the appearance of a hapless character from the comic pages of daily newspapers. Yet within 2 years, Bowers had built the White Knights into a deadly operation. He believed his work was not only inspired by God, but blessed by his own ancestors. Bowers' pedigree was stronger than most Klansmen. He had a touch of college and could claim class from a family background that imbued with Southern gentility and political influence. He had a grandfather who had been a congressman from South Mississippi. Still, Bowers had an affinity for the uneducated, working class men usually associated with the Klan. He expressed admiration for these, quote, simple, disadvantaged, low economic people who were standing up on their hind legs and defying the federal government. Much in a long philosophical discussion of his role as a leader, Bowers said, "I'm not ashamed to be an uncultured, uncouth, ignorant redneck," close quote. But he also sought the company of better educated men, lawyers and preachers, whom he lured into his organization. When he talked about himself, it was apparent Bowers had cultivated an unconventional persona as a vengeful Confederate cavalry officer turned post-war night rider. He also cited shamelessly his grandfather's reputation as an unreconstructed 4-term congressman, as well as his father's checkered employment record of bouncing from job to job, a malcontent who despised bureaucrats. So, able to develop, with the help of Tom Landry's journals, a pretty good portrait of Bowers and the way he operated, the way he talked, the friends he had. All of these people are identified. They're identified in Tom Landry's journal, and they're identified in my book. I'm going down to Laurel on Thursday to have an event. Don't know how friendly it's going to be compared to this one, but anyway, like a lot of people, I always thought that most of the Klansmen. I was working in Clarksdale at the time. We didn't have a Klan in Clarksdale. Basically, the Citizens Council ran Clarksdale, and they knew the Klan was counterproductive. People didn't recoil from the Klan. They felt it was trashy and kind of looked like they were auditioning for a place in the cast of Deliverance or something. But I found out that the Klan was fairly disparate group of members. Here's my description, some of my description of the Klan in general. In the fevered climate of the 1960s, Sam Bowers found it easy to recruit volunteers to join his group. There were no laws against Klan membership, and his followers believed that the White Knights represented the South's last best bulwark against racial integration. Some were attracted to Bauer's group by a commitment to the cause of white supremacy. Others were lured by the camaraderie. The White Knights served as a sort of men's club, offering an excuse to get out of the house at night. To some members, the protocol seemed not a lot different from that of the Masons, with an emphasis on robes and secret ceremony that excluded Catholics and Jews. Those eager to legitimize the Klan compared the group to the American Legion, the super patriotic veterans clubs that kept watch to ensure that no communists set foot in their neighborhood. The White Knights had a diverse membership. Some were lonely men who held unrewarding jobs and looked to the White Knights for excitement. Sprinkled into this element were a handful of well-to-do businessmen or ambitious young men on the make. Still others were lured by the ministry of rogue preachers who gave the Klan their blessing. And a few of them, like Bowers, felt the mission of the White Knights represented a divinely ordained undertaking. Before he joined the White Knights, Tom Lander had assumed that most of the members came from poor backgrounds. We quickly realized that the group included popular church deacons, respectable businessmen, and civic leaders. We found that the Masonite Corporation, the pillar of commerce for Laurel and one of the largest industries in the state, was infested with Klansmen earning respectable salaries. Landrum's original perception of the White Knights membership held up. Many of the Klansmen felt wounded by society, poorly educated, ignorant of modern skills, and consigned to unrewarding jobs. They seethed over their own situation. Some had served blue-collar apprenticeships as roughnecks on treacherous offshore oil stations in the nearby Gulf, or labored on the drilling rigs that dotted Jones County. Others held grim places on the line at minor factories or scrabbled for irregular income as shade tree mechanics, lumber mill operatives, gas station grease monkeys, door-to-door salesmen of shoddy goods, or farmers striving to wrestle a prosperous crop from the punishing soil in the region too far from the Mississippi River to have been blessed by its rich alluvial deposits. Resentment boiled up in them like bile from an unsettled stomach, and it somehow hardened into a hatred of the black man. The alchemy proved powerful in Mississippi with its history of slavery and suppression. It involved a woolly belief in the Southern way of life, where whites enjoyed dominance and gentle darkies existed only to serve them. Even as many of these Klansmen struggled themselves, it was essential to their pride to keep their place above the bottom. The idea of white supremacy was nourished not only at clandestine meetings, but also publicly, either from the pulpit by self-appointed preachers espousing racial doctrines rarely taught at divinity schools, or through myths perpetuated by a long line of political leaders specializing in demagoguery. So enough of the book. I'll just mention a couple of other things and open it up for any questions you might have. One of the amazing things was the leadership of ministers, mostly fundamentalist ministers. You had that in the Neshoba County case too, with a guy named Preacher Killen, who one of the organizers of those murders. And one of one of the team leaders on the raid on the Damer house was a guy named Cecil Sussman, who was called Little Preacher. That was a self-ordained Baptist minister, and just an unusual character. So many of them were. And through Landrum's journal, I really got a good sense of what Sussman was all about. And Tom was befuddled by Sussman. He was a real mystery because sometimes he seemed like really a God-fearing man, and other times he was a racist demon and kind of tortured fellow. One other great source of information for me were documents I found at the Southern Mississippi Library. And they were really thousands of pages of FBI documents during their investigation of white knights. They were collected by a man named Bob Helfrich, who at the time of Bauer's last trial was assistant district attorney. He's now a state judge, but he turned it all over to the library. And that library also has some very valuable material from other people, but I spent days there going through that information and got a better sense of the FBI role in this. Now, the FBI certainly was glorified in the movie Mississippi Burning, but there was also a great deal of criticism of their role. They had a mandate, and I remember the FBI men telling me in Clarksville, our role is not to protect anybody. We're here only to investigate, usually after the fact. And certainly they learned from Tom Landrum and others. Tom wasn't the only person who had become an informant. There were several others you could tell from these documents. Some of it I recognized right away. Well, that came from Tom, but there were others from obviously different sources. Some cases the FBI paid money. Tom Landrum never got a cent from the FBI. They paid, that's how they broke Neshoba County. They paid informants who told them where the bodies were buried, and eventually ratted out each other, and it led to a number of arrests in that case. There were some real dedicated FBI people. I got to know Jim Ingram, who later became head of Mississippi Highway Patrol. He kind of moved down here after he was sent after the Neshoba County case. President Johnson ordered 150 extra FBI men detailed to Mississippi. Their director at the time was good old J. Edgar Hoover, who had done a very good job of turning himself into a saint, a guy who had a great crime fighter, and he hated communists. And part of Hoover's problem was that he thought the civil rights movement was being run by communists. So he was not at all sympathetic with the FBI's role, and it was President Johnson who essentially forced him to dispatch these extra agents to come to Mississippi. They were involved in at least two major illegal tactics in connection with their work. In the Damer case, they essentially knew who was responsible, but they were trying to develop more information. They imported a mafia hitman from New York who was also an FBI informant. His name was Gregory Starfer. And I've got a copy of the dispatch from FBI office in Jackson, the FBI in New York, asking for New York to send Gregory Scarpa down to Jones County, where he would be met by an agent who was at that time working in Mississippi, but had previously helped, run Scarpa's work in New York. And Scarpa came and was accompanied by two people, and we think they were two people who were Mississippi crooks who were facing certain charges, and they were willing to drop the charges. They were running an auto theft ring if they would go with Scarpa, and they picked out a guy they thought was a weak link in the White Knights, who was a local TV repairman, Lawrence Bird. And they went into Bird's store just as he was closing one night, knocked him over the head, and frog marched him out to the car and drove him around, probably to federal land at Camp Shelby right outside of Hattiesburg, and beat the hell out of him. Scarpa rammed the pistol into his mouth. Scarpa broke down and began a series of confessions and talked repeatedly to the FBI for about a month. Clearly illegal, but the FBI and anybody who was trying to fight the Klan felt that this was such a terrible opponent that anything that worked would be good and acceptable, but not exactly due process. They had also later, when the White Knights turned their wrath on Jews in Mississippi, this was late in the game. It was after they had been largely broken up in Jones County, and they moved into Jackson and Meridian, began bombing synagogues and the homes of rabbis and homes of prominent Jewish businessmen. In order to try to put them down, the FBI met with people who were prominent in the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish organization, and they wanted to know, what can we do to protect our people? And the FBI said, well, you can give money to a slush fund. We need money. And so they raised thousands of dollars into a slush fund. It was used in the end to set up an ambush in Meridian, where they had not only FBI, they had a SWAT team from the local police. They had dozens of gunmen waiting on the car that was delivering a bomb to the home of a prominent Jewish businessman. And as soon as good old Tom Tarrant stepped out with carrying the bomb, they started shooting and shot him down. He was able to crawl back in the car, try to drive away. They had all the exit roads blocked. They finally had this huge fight with hundreds of bullets flying, and they eventually captured Terrence, who somehow lived through it. But in going through the car, they found not only a mother load of ammunition, but they found the body of a young woman who was a popular school teacher in Jackson. So it was a weird time. And I hope I do justice to Tom Landrum and good people, good men and women who did everything they could to make sure that evil didn't triumph. And that's the book, and my story. I'm sticking to it, but my story with the great help of Tom Landrum, is a truly wonderful man, quintessential good man. That was my fortune to get to know. So Uh, Any questions that you might have, John?
The title of your book, Live, will I be in past tense, evil lived.
It is past tense. I'm gonna assure the people in law. Judge Charles Pickering, who incidentally was very helpful to me, he had been the county prosecuting attorney during this period, and he was one of the few living sources I had to work with. And he asked me, he almost pleaded with me to change the title of the book. Actually, it had a different working title. It was Behind the Veil of Secrecy, which one plan went through. And Norton, my publisher, said, need something sexier than that. So, the word evil has good ring to it. So I came up with that, and Judge Pickering said, you come up with another name. Anyway, I did, but I kept telling Judge Pickering, Judge, past tense. You expelled evil.
Do you think that's true that is the plan still intact in Mississippi, or what about the Laurel area?
Well, have to watch my tone, but Jones County is kind of an interesting place. It's a good euphemism for Jones County. And there are plenty of bad people still around. And still, we've got a lot of work to do to ensure racial reconciliation in the state. So, but the Klan itself is effectively gone. Got haters, but they're not organized under the rubric of Klan. Yeah, it's interesting that everybody who's clinging to Colonel Reb and the Confederate battle flag, these were the symbols used by the Ku Klux Klan. They honored this. So remember that the next time, they're angry at Ole Miss for dismissing some of these, or the people who finally got rid of our state flag that had Confederate battle flag. And think of what that flag meant to 1/3 of the population of the state, as well as a whole lot of white people. They worship the Confederates.
Curtis, was it Tom Landrum who reached out to John Evans about telling the story? And if so, why do you think he wanted his story told?
Well, thank you, Lloyd, for bringing that up. Lloyd Hewitt's from my home county, Pike County. That's the other thing I'm going to tell the people in Jones County. I said, I could have just as easily written a book and called it When Evil Lived in Pike County. So we were known as the church burning capital of the world in '64. 25 black churches were blown up or burned down by the Klan. It was a different thing called the United Klan. But anyway, I should have pointed this out, so thank you for asking that question. Tom had been identified in a book published, self-published by a guy in Jones County, and he was identified as a Klansman in the book. He obviously troubled him. And he had asked for a letter from J. Edgar Hoover when he accepted the challenge to join the Klan, and that said that Tom Landrum joined the Klan. Anyway, Hoover never delivered the letter. And didn't want anybody doing anything that he couldn't control. I admire Hoover, to say the least. So Tom was troubled. His family learned finally at around this point of his role. And he told them that. He showed them these journals. And Tom was a very modest guy. Nobody going around tooting his horn, but he essentially wanted to clear his name. And so they, Mike, you'd have to help me, but my sense is that you all got in touch with Mike Frascona, the lawyer in Jackson. And I had to ask John Evans when I'm at Lemuria tomorrow. I assumed that Frascona was the guy who contacted Evans and asked, who might be interested in writing that. And Evans gave him my name. So anyway, it's basically, Tom Landrum didn't want to be remembered as a Klansman. He wanted to be remembered for what he had done. Simple as that.
I've got one.
Any other? Oh,
Hi.
Caitlin.
Yeah, so this comes from a Zoom attendee. They want to know, how do you think today's national challenge with white supremacy and voter suppression fits with the challenges of the 60s in Mississippi?
Well, that's one thing that I think really,
Oh.
yeah, I'm sorry. Essentially, I've got my hearing aid on, but I'm not hearing everybody real well. It was, how does the current problems with racial discord and also controversies over voting rights, these are current events. These are issues we're dealing with today. And these are the same issues that we were dealing with in this book. So voting rights, by that time, you had already passed the Civil Rights Act in '64 and voting rights 65. And that was at the heart of Vernon Dahmer's work. So, all of this really broke out in the last year or two. Happily maybe for the book, that the issues that are being discussed in the book are the same ones that are being discussed nationally today. Is that responsive?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Okay. I just know that you do that. Thank you. I could have opened my book. Anyway, the line that I couldn't come up with. I did this in my test. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to be nothing. Tom Landrum couldn't have had a better good man. And Tom took a lot of courage. Hell, I wouldn't have done what he did. He risked his life, and he feared for his family. He had 5 children and a wife. Wife Ann Landrum, who had gotten to know a wonderful lady. She diligently typed up all of these reports to get she knew very well that she was at risk, and she had the foresight to periodically mail copies of these reports to her mother in Jackson, who filed them away in a lockbox. So when they wanted to rely on their work, there was incredible raw material for me in the book. Okay, that it? I'm excused. Thank you all.